How you doing today, John?
I'm hanging in there. How are you doing, Alex?
Doing pretty good. I'm excited to be back. I know we got a lot of questions this week, which I'm excited about, which we'll get to in a second. If you're just logging in and it's your first time or your 12th time now, just want to remind everyone we have the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We do have a good list of questions today that we'll get to in a second, but as John is talking, feel free to put any questions that come to mind, whether it's about the topic or not, in the box, and it will pop up on our end, and we'll try to leave some time to get to a couple questions. John, I know you have a little bit of reporting to kind of kick off the conversation, and then we'll get to the questions. Talk a little bit about the state economic recovery bill, and then also we've been talking the last couple of weeks about the eviction bill, the moratorium, and the extension that was just filed. So if you want to start off by talking about those two things, and then we'll get to the questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. So what's happening now in the State House is every 2 years, they wrap things up by July 31st. So there's a number of bills that are sort of, they always, like me, they wait to the deadline before they get their stuff done. And a lot of bills are coming through. The big one for businesses need to watch out for is the Economic Development Bill, now sometimes being called an Economic Recovery Bill. I guess technically it's now being called Partnerships for Growth, which is kind of an awkward name. But mostly we see these bills every 2 years, and this one's being tailored a little bit with the pandemic in mind, obviously. It popped out of the House Ways and Means Committee last Friday. It's about $370 million worth of borrowing for various economic development efforts that the state would run. Interesting aspects that were sort of new policy procedures in there. One is that there's a language to make it easier to get housing projects built through zoning votes at the local level. Right now, for most zoning votes, you need a 2/3 majority at your city council or town meeting for changing zoning for housing. And this bill, which has been championed by Governor Baker, would lower it to a simple majority. So the idea is that, there's often a pronounced or vocal minority that blocks these, and this would get these projects through kind of over the objections of the minority. There's a lot of support for it, but there's also a lot of concern that this will gentrify communities and make the housing crisis worse. So the House leadership supports it. The Senate version of the Economic Development Bill does not include it, but there's going to be some effort to attach it during the floor debate in the Senate, which is going to happen on Wednesday. Also interesting is that they're trying to legalize sports betting. Now, that was in the House bill, not in the Senate bill. Will it have much of an economic development impact? Probably not that much, but it does help the casinos. Because they basically, either the casinos or the fantasy sports companies would be like DraftKings would be the ones that'd be able to do sports betting. And it theoretically could bring in $50 million a year in taxes. And that brings me to my third point. A chunk of that money would go to restaurants, about a third would go to restaurants to help them out. And so in the House bill, that sets aside money for a new distressed restaurant fund that is basically just grants for restaurants that are struggling because of the pandemic. The Senate, because it doesn't have sports betting, borrows $20 million to do a similar thing. So they have to sort of iron out their differences, hopefully by the end of the week, which is when they're scheduled to adjourn. Now, because they don't have a state budget, they probably will return for a special session, which is unprecedented in modern times. But they have not passed the state budget yet because they're waiting to hear what kind of help, if any, they'll get from Washington. So that's sort of the rundown with the Economic Development Bill. And you mentioned the eviction moratorium. Governor Baker has the authority to extend the moratorium on evictions for up to 90 days. He extended it for essentially 60 days through October 17th. The one thing I'm hearing from, this affects, basically if you're living in an apartment, you don't have to pay rent during this time, and you don't have to worry about being evicted as a result. But it also applies to small businesses. But I'm hearing from some small businesses that are not, that are paying the rent, because what it doesn't do is absolve your need to pay the rent eventually. And so you get to the end of the moratorium, and then you've got a huge bill you got to pay. And so, rent is a huge problem for businesses right now, especially those like restaurants who have very little revenue coming in. And so it's a tough call, do you wait and hope for things will return or get better once the moratorium's over, and you're back to full speed and you can work out a payment plan with your landlord. I guess I would say is I don't see any sign that the economy is going to be much better now, like in October, than it is right now. So I would not plan on a rebound, which I think everyone, when this whole thing started, everyone was thinking we'd be bouncing back as soon as June or July. And now I suspect it's going to be we're going to be sort of in this weird limbo for many months to come into 2021.
Definitely. It seems like, at least with the state bill, they're keeping the small businesses in mind.
They definitely are, which is great to see, because, I'll say that the small businesses do have lobbyists, but they're not as powerful as the big businesses in terms of getting their voices heard. So it's great to see the legislature and the Baker administration worrying about small businesses too.
Definitely. So we'll get to the questions now. Just a reminder, now that we have more people logged in, if you do have a question while we're talking, just use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to leave some time for a couple good questions that come in. But John, the first question we had, which you were kind of talking a little bit about in terms of growth in the future, we had a question about the projection of growth for the city, but also the state for the rest of the year and the first half of next year. And what are some areas of opportunity in terms of new businesses, new small businesses that might come into the market during that time?
Well, it's a very hard thing to project growth right now. I think economists are sort of flying blind. The UMass or the Mass Benchmarks, which is run by the UMass Donahue Institute, projections based on various factors, numeric factors, and their most recent one said the economy is going to sink by 4%, contract by 4% over the next few months. But I think even the economists that are on that panel that oversee that say that is far too low, that the economy is going to shrink by much more than that. So, we've got about 20% of the people in the workforce that are without jobs. It's going to have a huge impact. And like I was saying earlier, I am concerned that there isn't, we sort of maybe come back from the nadir when everything was under lockdown, but I think that there's going to be a very cautious approach by state government to open up things much further. And I also think I think people aren't ready to go out there and spend a lot of their money. Businesses aren't bringing a lot of people back, partly out of concern of safety, because we don't have a vaccine. And so I think until an effective vaccine can be widely distributed, we're sort of in this, it's not going to get much better than it is right now, I hate to say. That's just the reality. I certainly, a couple of months ago, was hoping we wouldn't have to wait for a vaccine for the economy to have a significant recovery. And people were telling me that then. I'm like, oh, that can't be, that's way too long. I'm not saying a full recovery. It's going to be longer to get to a full recovery, but I mean a recovery where, we're sort of flat, that unemployment rate is not, it's 17% now, back under 10% in single digits, and it's going to be a long time. And so, the slowness to bring people back to the office affects, the businesses next to those offices, the small businesses. There are restaurants, many restaurants that still haven't reopened. And hotels, I just looked at the hotel numbers for May year over year. Revenue, that the state keeps track of it, revenue is down it's like less than 10% of what it was a year ago. And that was in the thick of the lockdown, but some of the hotels have reopened, but it's like I hear the occupancy rates 10, 20%. Places like the Cape are doing better. I think better than a lot of people expected, because there aren't many people want to go on vacation. We're all kind of tired being cooped up in our house. and there aren't many other. No one's eager to fly, or very few people are eager to fly. And the Baker administration, like his counterparts in other New England states, have really kind of trying to close the door on traveling outside of our little bubble of New England, where our cases, knock on wood, are still pretty low. The death rate's low. I mean, that's part of the problem is like COVID is raging in most of the country. And I think that does suppress consumers' behavior here in Massachusetts. So I think it's going to be a slow grind. The state's economy could contract by more than 25% this year as a result.
Yeah, we had one question about kind of the optimism or pessimism around small businesses. I think it's a confusing economic time just because the stock market is strong and there's a lot of talk about that. But on the ground, kind of in a city like Boston, small businesses still really are struggling just because of different restrictions and people's comforts with going out or not going out. So talk a little bit about your view in terms of, are we being overly pessimistic? Are we being overly optimistic? Are we being realistic right now in terms of, are we going to see more businesses shut down even as the year and into next year progresses? What's kind of your outlook in terms of, I guess, people binarily saying?
I will say the Mass Inc. polling group just polled, working with a bunch of organizations, polled about 2,000 small businesses. And the result, I would say, was better than I expected. I mean, I'll give you the bad news first. Basically, about half of small businesses said they lost 50% of their revenue or more. It could have been as much as 90%. Within the pandemic period versus the same time last year. I mean, that's pretty serious. But very few, and of course it might be a biased sample because these are the ones who responded, but very few said they're not going to reopen or they're going to shut down completely. Most small businesses have reopened, maybe partially. They're working fewer hours, they're employing fewer people. They're very tentative. I mean, to some extent, the state rules limit, if you're talking about stores or restaurants, limit how many people you can serve at any one time. So you're not going to bring on a full workforce as a result. But sometimes, to some extent, it's just being cautious about the return of, consumers willing to shop, willing to get outside, and especially, as things get worse in most of the country. So I was surprised that very few said they were going to close down. I think that reflects the optimism of small business owners. I talk to small business owners regularly who I don't even know how they're pulling it together. They're getting coins from under the sofa mattress to pay the bills. And I worry that, this current economic climate, it's unsustainable, until you're at least breaking even again. And so I think we are going to see more small business failures. I hate to say it. Every day it seems like I hear about a new restaurant that's closing, and the restaurants are high profile because people go in them frequently. And they're sort of institutions in the neighborhoods where they are. So we don't hear about some of the other small businesses that are closing. I do think it's a good proxy for some of the other small businesses, say like the dry cleaners or the barber shops that also can't make it work anymore.
Definitely. You talked a little bit about tourism and kind of the Cape and whatnot. Talk a little bit about, we had a question about tourism, any updates, any new insights. I imagine the city is hurting because people aren't flying into the city for the summer, but places like the Cape, even Nantucket or the Vineyard are probably doing the same, if not, maybe a little better, a little worse. Talk a little bit about, the balance of those two factors, because we don't really have, the out-of-staters, but within the state, it seems like it might be pretty strong for the rest of the summer, at least.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say is the Cape Cod is probably, the short-term rental business, they're all booked up, but that's a very small part of the overall economy there. It's crucial because it's a place where people can stay when they're coming, and they spend the money. They spend the money on going out to, eat at restaurants or going to some of the attractions. And I think the attraction is also the Cape, even though, they don't have events this summer and they don't have the Cape League games. just going to the beach for a day is a nice break. And so that doesn't cost any money or very little if you're paying for parking. So the Cape is an attractive place, I would say, for tourists, either within Connecticut or within New England. Obviously, if you're traveling from outside of the governor's, sanctioned area, it's much more complicated, especially now that he's tried to put some teeth into his 14-day quarantine rule. That took effect last week, where you could be fined if you come here from outside of the designated New England, New York, New Jersey, and Hawaii area, if you're not COVID free through a test. And so I think that will have that. It's really just sort of an amplification of a policy that was already in place, but I think that'll have some additional chilling effect on tourism. In terms of getting people from outside the region. I spoke to the head of the Boston Tourism Bureau, and she said, well, maybe, but most of the people who are coming here are driving anyway, and they're coming from within that Northeast area because so few people want to fly. But she had been hoping that maybe more people would be flying in, and we could start to see more of a bump. And that, in Boston, they're really suffering, like I said, 10 to 20% occupancy in the hotels. And now they've got to live on the drive tourists who come from, the adjacent states versus people who are flying in for some time to come. So it's challenging. I do think the Cape, I'm not quite as familiar as what's happening on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, but they seem still pretty lively. So I think they're doing better than expected. Not as good as last year. The short-term rentals, like I said, they booked right up. But, the restaurants, I think people are not spending as much money down there. I don't think the traffic on the bridges, I could be wrong about this, but last time I checked, it was not as bad as it was last year. So that's sort of an indication, not that they figured out how to solve the bridge problem, but that you're not getting quite the same heavy level of traffic in and out of Cape Cod.
For sure. One more question on something that you touched on earlier as well. We had a question about commercial real estate, and I know this ties into kind of the eviction moratorium and things like that. This person wants to know about a potential commercial real estate collapse. What are your thoughts on that? At some point, the businesses have to be able to, like you said, fulfill the rent, whether it's later or over a payment plan. But at some point, they need to be able to ramp up, to get to at least break even, as you put it.
This is so I'm gonna. When you think about commercial real estate, you're some small businesses, but you're also talking about the big office users in downtown Boston. And, the tower owners would say, well, we're doing okay because 95%, fill in the blank, but it's more than 90% are still paying their leases. But we're looking at sublease rates that are, the highest they've been since well before the Great Recession. And so much empty space is going on the market. I'm hearing anecdotally about companies that are just not renewing leases when their leases come up, and they just go virtually, and they're like, well, let's see what happens. So many companies are scaling back the rate at which they're bringing people back. I am working on a story essentially describing this, where we thought everyone was going to go back maybe after Labor Day. Now more and more companies are saying January 1st, we'll start requiring more people come back in the office. Some of the people that are saying January 1st are now like moving into the summer of next year. This is not good for the office real estate market. I don't envision a collapse per se, but I do think it's going to be a serious. It's going to be a serious impact. There's no doubt about it. No one is going to be expanding, adding major expansions in downtown Boston anytime soon. The suburbs appear to be more flat, which is encouraging so far. And there is talk about, rather than have big downtown offices. I think we've talked about this before, although I've yet to hear about leases being signed, of satellite offices. Like you might have a big financial company with an office downtown that might be like, well, I'd rather have 3 offices ringing Boston and then a small downtown office. Because people, you cannot discount the discomfort that people are feeling about taking the T right now. Many people do not want to get on public transit. And then, of course, there's also the issue of sharing elevators with people or building lobbies. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that, and the employers know it. So I think this, the short term, there's going to be some pain, and long term, there's going to be some pain. It's going to take a while to recover. For the office market to recover. I'd be surprised if it's a collapse. I mean, I think Boston, even though we have we're heavily dependent on universities, and the universities are sort of, it's a mix of hybrid, a mix of some are in person, some are remote, and that obviously has an impact on the local economy because fewer kids are here than normal. But I do think that we're better positioned than most economies to bounce back because of the amount of software as a service companies we have here. These are, subscription software. Basically, almost any major software company is now a software as a service company, and so that's recurring revenue. And they've, been able to serve their customers well through the pandemic. And most of those companies are either flat or growing. So long term, I don't see it's going to destroy the Boston economy. I think we'll be better off than other metro areas for the most part, but I do feel like this is going to be a really damaging thing for the entire national economy for, a long time to come.
What about how the demand might affect, pricing, both kind of residential and commercial? I have to imagine it's probably going to be a longer tail. I'm sure landlords are still going to try to, maintain market value, but if the demand isn't there, I'm thinking maybe sometime in 2021 or even beyond there, if it still doesn't recover, it's gonna.
Oh, you got to see prices go down. I mean, I can't really. I haven't quite tracked like what the impact has been on leases yet. And I think it would be marginal because that's like a lagging indicator. I would say though, if you look at home prices in the suburbs, home prices are continuing to climb. Boston, it's surprisingly the prices are still going up, but I hear an awful lot about people who know, they see units that are for sale in their neighborhood that would be scooped up a year ago that are sitting. And so I think we're going to see sort of an evening out, but prices are already so expensive. It's going to take, I would say both in terms of rents and buying homes and buying buildings, it's going to take a while for those. We were almost due for a correction anyway, and that and whenever sort of economic downturn that was eventually going to come would have corrected things a little bit. I do think pandemic's accelerating that a bit, but yeah, I mean it's tough. People don't want to move their prices in terms of leasing, and so it's going to take a while for that to trickle out.
For sure. We had a bunch of questions across, talking about education, whether it's the colleges or schools reopening. So I think it's worth spending a couple minutes talking about that and kind of the economic side to it. Obviously, no one's really sure how it's all going to play out. Even with sports, you look at what happened with MLB just yesterday. Baseball opened up just fine, no COVID tests, and then 3 games into the season, and then one team already has a wide spread. So no one really knows what's going to happen, even if schools do decide to open. So talk a little bit about, obviously, the uncertainty with the path forward, but, whether schools open or not, kind of what the economic outlook is.
Are you talking about for universities or public schools?
Well, I think both, and I think both have different kind of economic impacts. So maybe talk a little bit about the colleges and universities, and then maybe on a local level, kind of.
Yeah, we've got a good sense of where the colleges and universities, and I feel like almost every college is doing something a little bit different. But like I said, it's sort of a range. One thing that I do see is that seems to be popular is sending people, if you're coming in person, sending them home after Thanksgiving. So you're not coming back for a few weeks after Thanksgiving and bringing whatever germs you have back to the campus, just sending them home for Thanksgiving for the rest of the year. A lot of these students that are in sort of these mixed hybrid models will still be paying rent for the year. But, if they're going back to live with their parents, they're probably not going to spend the same kind of money that they would have spent otherwise during that time. And yeah, and there's some, graduate schools that are all online the whole school year. And, some people want to be here regardless for that. But I think I think if you're younger and you can crash with your parents right now, you might be doing that because it's just a smart way to save money. So yeah, there's going to be impacts. I mean, with public schools, it's the big question mark right now. And I think we're starting to see school, start the word to get out that it's going to be like a hybrid maybe, where you go, because some kids go in one day, some kids go on another day, maybe your kid goes on Mondays and Wednesdays. And I think that, as a result of that, employers are going to be very flexible, allowing their workers to work from home if you have kids. There is sort of like this so this effect of having to work from home with your kids that sort of slows the economy down in a way. It's hard to really articulate or calculate. It's a little intangible. I mean, when it first happened, I think everyone just sort of hunkered down and got the job done because it needed to be done. It was an emergency. And by the job, quote unquote, I'm talking about the tasks they have at hand for their work. And I think people thought, we'll make it to summer, we'll make it to summer camps, we'll make it to the next school year, and then we'll get back to some semblance of normalcy. But how much longer, obviously we're not in some semblance of normalcy, and how much longer can people keep the same effort of balancing sort of work and home life the way they have? It's got to have some sort of intangible impact on the economy in terms of productivity. Most companies are saying they're very surprised at how people have been working home. But I've got to feel over the long haul, there's some detriments with people working from home too, that's going to slow things down a bit.
Definitely makes a lot of sense. Probably have time for one question that came in through the Q&A box. This person wants to know, what do you see for bankruptcy increases for small businesses, and then the impact on other small businesses and the repayment of government incentive loans? So maybe talking about PPP and how business performance might impact the ability to repay those.
Yeah, I mean, with the Paycheck Protection Program, I think most users of that, from what I can tell, and again, I don't have data on that yet, I'm just going from people I've interviewed, so it's anecdotal, are going to treat that as a grant. They basically, the way they structured it, they sort of extended how much time you needed to have people on staff to qualify for it to be forgiven. So, I mean, the terms of the loan are, are pretty good. I mean, it's like 1%, and you have plenty of time to pay it back, but no one wants to add extra debt at this time. So I think if you took a PPP, for the most part, you were thinking, okay, this is going to be free money. I'm going to be able to be forgiven because I'm taking it and I meet the parameters to have it be forgiven. Bankruptcies are obviously going up. We're seeing a lot of retail chains file for bankruptcy. It's fairly distressing because they have, unlike many companies, they have leases all over the place. And so what happens, when a bunch of retailers at a mall all file for bankruptcy all at once? Maybe, some of them close down all their stores, but some of them are trying to stay as a functioning business, but they're going to use the bankruptcy to cut a lot of leases. You have that happen over and over again with malls and strip plazas. Normally maybe it'd be one or two chains that file for bankruptcy at one time, but the fact that we've got a dozen or so, at least, probably much more than that, going through bankruptcy and cutting leases, that's going to have huge impacts for retail real estate, particularly in the suburbs and at the malls. And then that has impacts, for some towns, the malls and the strip plazas are their main sources of tax revenue. So if those go into bankruptcy or foreclosure, then you run into problems collecting taxes on those. So there's, not to mention the fact that, people work at those places and they're losing jobs and have a tougher time paying the bills when they lose their jobs. So there's sort of like this ongoing ripple effect from having all these retailers file for bankruptcy at once. I do think it's not just limited to retail, but the retailers are by far the most prominent because they, everyone recognizes their names. They have, they're all over the place with leases, and we're seeing a ton of those.
Definitely makes a lot of sense. John, anything else, on the front of your mind that we weren't able to touch on in terms of the questions before we wrap this up?
No, I think that we covered a lot of ground. I guess the recurring theme, not to be a prophet of doom, but the recurring theme I guess I'd have for it in terms of advice is that where we're at now is where we're going to be at for a while. And so, the PPP, for example, was originally designed to kind of get you over the hump through the worst of it. And that's great. And, people got some help from the federal government, but now we're not, we have reopened obviously, but we're not, the economy has only improved somewhat. And I don't see it getting much better until there's a vaccine and people feel comfortable and COVID rates drop down to essentially zero. And that's unfortunately, Cambridge company Moderna started the next phase of their vaccine trials. They're moving right along, and that's great to see. But I mean, this is a breakneck pace for vaccine development. We've never seen a vaccine develop this quickly. So I think 2021 is probably the best we can hope for a widely available vaccine.
Definitely. Well, we'll be here in 2 weeks to have more updates, and unfortunately, probably more of the same, like you're saying. Yeah. But definitely, we'll do our best to keep everyone informed. Definitely submit your questions ahead of time if you're planning on tuning in again in 2 weeks. We love the questions. It's where we base our conversations around. So be sure to get those in. And enjoyed it, John. Thanks a lot for the time as always.
Yeah.
And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks.
See everyone later.